Call Fed and State to order Monday, February 7th. First thing on the agenda is bill introductions. Senator Hildebrand, you have one?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I do. It is RS 2364, designating bridges on US 166 and K66 as Veterans Memorial Bridge.
Okay, any questions? Any objections? The bill's introduced. I have a couple. The first is it's RS 2511, and it's dealing with license plates for Eastern Stars. Are there any questions? Are there any objections? It's introduced. Oh.
So, Mr. Chairman, Eastern Stars is...
It's not my group. It's someone from back in Johnson County.
So is it a group of ladies?
Yeah.
Okay,
ladies.
I like that group. I know that group. Okay, thank you.
I'll have them work with you. The bill's introduced. We got one more bill. It's RS 3059. It's dealing with plastic containers preemption law. Is there any questions on that bill? Not seeing any. Any objections? The bill's introduced. Are there any other bills to introduce? Senator Longbine, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. RS 2945, dealing with unemployment insurance.
Any questions? Any objections? The bill's introduced. Are there any further bills to introduce? Senator Hosher?
Just for clarification, I do have one that's getting a couple of changes. Maybe I can do that tomorrow.
We got plenty of time to introduce bills. We're not like other committees. Any other bill introduction? Okay, not seeing any. We're going to go ahead and we'll open the hearing on Senate Bill 375. Jason, why don't you give us an overview?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 375 would enact the Kansas Housing Investor Tax Credit Act. This is an act to provide tax credits for builders, developers, and qualified investors in housing building projects in more rural cities and counties in the state of Kansas. I'll direct your attention first to some of the definitions on pages 1 and 2 of the bill. A qualified housing project is defined as a housing project in a city or county for single-family or multifamily dwellings. Includes manufactured and modular homes with a permanent foundation. It does not include qualified low-income housing projects, as that term is defined under the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Act. So you can't get tax credits both for a low-income housing project and one of these qualified housing projects. The cities and counties in which these projects must be located would be a city with a population of less than 70,000 or a county with a population of less than 75,000. The act is administered by the Secretary of Commerce, and so the project builder or developer would apply to the Secretary for a designation of the project as a qualified housing project. Upon approval of that application, the Secretary would then enter into an agreement with the builder or developer for the designation. The builder would have to submit progress reports to the Secretary and allow Secretary access to the project and the financial records of the builder to ensure that the project remains a qualified housing project. Also, there would be provisions for repayment of the tax credit amounts if there is a loss of that designation as a qualified project. The tax credits would be an amount determined by the Secretary, but they would be limited to $30,000 for each residential unit in the project, up to a maximum of 40 units for that particular project, or 30% of the total cost of the project, whichever is less. So that would be the cap. In addition to builders and developers receiving a tax credit for their investment in the project, a qualified investor could invest a cash investment into the project and receive a tax credit for the amount of their cash investment, of course, subject to those limitations on the overall amount of tax credit available per project. There is an aggregate annual limit on the amount of tax credits that can be allocated by the Secretary of $18 million each fiscal year. However, there are also provisions that if a portion of that $18 million is not allocated in a fiscal year, it may be carried forward into subsequent fiscal years and allocated in addition to the $18 million annual limit by the Secretary in those subsequent fiscal years. The tax credit may be carried forward for up to 4 years if there isn't sufficient tax liability for the taxpayer. They can carry it forward. There's also a provision that if the taxpayer has no tax liability in the year in which they are allocated the tax credit, they may transfer that credit one time to another taxpayer for the full amount of the tax credit, and that third-party taxpayer could then use the tax credit and apply it against their tax credit liability. I will note that the tax credit is only applicable to income tax and the privilege tax for financial institutions. It does not apply under the bill as written to the premium tax paid by insurance companies under state law. There are provisions in the bill that if the project loses designation, the Secretary has to give notice prior to that, give the builder developer an opportunity to cure the deficiencies. If there is no cure, the Secretary can rescind that designation. At that point, the builder and developer would be obligated to repay any tax credits that have been allocated to them and that they've taken the benefit of. The repayment provisions are not applicable to a qualified investor who has made a cash investment. They would retain their tax credit benefit regardless of loss of designation. There are finally provisions for the Secretary to monitor and oversee compliance of the Act and submit an annual report by January 31st to the Governor and to the Standing Committees on Commerce in both the House and the Senate, detailing the total cash investments under this Act, estimated number of jobs facilitated by those qualified housing projects, and the estimated multiplier effect on the Kansas economy from those investments in the housing projects. The bill will go into effect on July 1st of this year if enacted, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Questions? Sir? Senator Fasquedo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, so just clarify, so you said these tax credits can't be used for low-income housing. Does that mean like HUD or Habitat for Humanity or?
Yeah, any housing project for which you have qualified and are receiving tax credit benefits under the federal low-income housing tax credit would not be eligible, as I read the bill, for tax credits under this act. You couldn't double dip, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And then, Mr. Chairman, Jason, so would these homes have to be built in a certain cluster area in a rural or urban area, or can they be throughout that area?
My understanding is that you would have, and when you apply to the Secretary, you would have a defined project in which you would be defined, I'm going to build X number of residential units within this area in this city of less than $70,000. So then the Secretary has a defined amount as to how to calculate your tax credit for that project.
70,000 people.
Yeah, 70,000 people, not 700,000.
These are my bills, and, you know, what I'm trying to do here, this is a brand-new bill, kind of based it off the Angel tax credit, and there's tweaks that probably need to be made in here and fixes, but we've got some low to moderate housing tax credits coming. They would have been last Thursday, but they're going to be, we got a bill that's dealing with low to moderate housing tax credits on Wednesday. We'll be hearing. This bill is, you know, if you utilize the whole 18 million and everybody capped out, it'd be 30,000 max. You'd build 600 houses. My guess is you're probably going to build, because some of them are going to be cheaper, some of them are not. You're going to probably build 800, maybe 850 houses, if this is fully utilized. But what this is, you can build, small apartment complexes, you can build 20 duplexes, you can build 40 houses, or you could build one. You could come in, we've got these cities across the state that need, one, someone might have a house that's been tore down, but the infrastructure's there where you can come back in and utilize it. But you've got questions, Senator Hildebrand? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Jason, mine is about the definition of a manufactured home and a modular home. A manufactured home is a mobile home, correct? Considered a mobile home?
I believe so. The bill refers to the existing statutory definitions for those terms, so I can certainly go back and look at those, but I believe the manufactured home, I believe, is like a mobile home, whereas a modular home is like a prefabricated home, is how if I recall correctly.
So I was just curious, since this is for building, what would it be like? Get the tax credit for like building the permanent foundation? Is that what they would? Because like on a modular home and a manufactured home, there's actually very little, no construction on a modular or manufactured except for utilities and the foundation. But then on a prefab, you have a little bit. So would that be the only thing that would be considered on the tax credit, or would be the whole thing?
I think the secretary would look at the whole cost to the developer for providing providing that type of housing. So that would require a permanent foundation for the manufactured or modular home, and then whatever the cost is for that home, if they're actually going to place the home there. And in those instances, the tax credit may be calculated more on the total cost rather than the $30,000 per unit, because it's whatever is less. So if your total cost is going to be, less than, 30% of your total cost is less than $30,000, you're going to get that amount rather than the $30,000.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, I think on the modular too, we had, back in the 70s, they built a lot of modular homes. They brought them in, put them on foundations. There's several manufacturers here in Kansas that were doing that. They're not doing, there's still some around, but they're not doing at the capacity they were. And that's just a potential for the rural areas with the tax credit to, be able to get more housing built. Any further questions? Yep, Senator Frasco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, can you restate and explain a little better about the transferring that tax credit as it relates to the liability, I think you said?
Well, so there's the provision on transferring the tax credit. So if the builder, developer, or the qualified investor is allocated a tax credit amount and they have no tax liability for that year, they can transfer their credit to another taxpayer. It's a one-time transfer, it must be the full amount, and then that other taxpayer could then use that certificate of tax credit when they file their income taxes and get a credit against their income tax liability in that instance. In terms of liability, I think you might be referring to the repayment liability. And so if the project loses its designation as a qualified housing project, the builder developer would have to repay the amount of tax credit benefit they had received. The qualified investor would not have to do so.
Okay, that answers questions? Okay, I think we'll go ahead and just move on if that answers all the questions. I'm the first up, and I just want to hit some highlights of it. It's definitely a 30% tax credit up to $100,000. So you would have $100,000 invested. The tax credit would be $30,000. So if it come in at $90,000, it'd be $30,000. We're looking for ways to try to incentivize building in the rural parts of the state. And we've got an appraisal issue, so that's where that number come from. So we modeled this kind of like the angel tax credit, but we also want to allow them to be able to sell the tax credit because not everybody can use it. You're still getting 70% investment. You know, also remember all the jobs you're creating, building the property. The sales tax often gets overlooked. So if you have a $100,000 project, you know, at least probably 40 to 45,000 will have sales tax on it. So there's a portion of the repayment there. You know, we were looking at a number of up to 40 units that one individual could do. You know, I'm guessing the housing department will try to maximize the use across, because we have this in Commerce, but there'll be an amendment to move that over to the housing authority. They will maximize the use of, you know, however many doors we need in a town. You know, some will be 40, some will be 20, some will just be one filling in. If it, like I said, this $18 million fiscal note, if they used all 30,000, it'd be 600 residents. I think that's more like 800, 850, because, you know, some people will use the modular version. You know, on the population numbers, that there again, I mean, I'm willing to work with someone to change on the county and the city to what everybody feels is right. These are work in progress. This is, you know, I met with a lot of people over the summer. I mean, every group tried to listen to their needs. I think this tax credit is a good way to get housing built in the state. We've got a second bill that we'll talk about that we're already kind of using, but so with that, I think I'll just go ahead and go to Ross Vogel, Heartland Housing Partners. And Ross is someone I worked with over the summer, so go ahead, Ross. Why don't you kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what this does?
Thank you, Senator Olson, Senators. My company, Heartland Housing Partners, has developed about $175 million in housing in underserved markets in Kansas over the last 10 years. We're extremely proud of that work, but the reality is that we could be doing a lot more. But every conversation about a housing project and all of those $175 million that we did get invested started with, well, the economics don't work, so let's start looking at the programs that we can help make those economics work. As Senator Olson mentioned, he and I were introduced last session. And over the last year, have met about once a week, either he and I or with stakeholders. And ultimately, we looked at 10 or 12 ideas or thoughts and what would be right to, what would be the most effective bills that would kickstart or do a better job of seeing Kansas housing be developed. And ultimately, we boiled it down to what's in these two bills. The vision for this tax credit is for community development leaders, for employers, for groups like Habitat for Humanity, for developers, for builders, to be able to operate in an environment that is nimble and flexible. And the reality is, we could be. Senator Olson and I sat down and visited this morning, said, hey, have you talked to so-and-so in this town? I said, yeah, I have. The reality is the economics don't work. And until the next round of we're going to hear about Bill 376. MIH comes around. There's no deal to be done there unless we can make the economics work, and they don't work today. I think there's something really important to point out about Kansas and the housing market. And Kansas is not unlike a lot of other states. And that is that there aren't enough people swinging hammers. And I use that metaphorically, meaning, you know, not enough people building right now. And in parts of the state, there certainly are, but a lot of that's just pure economics. Once again, the economics don't work for developers, they don't work for builders, and we have to make sure they work for the end consumer. And one other key aspect of that that I get concerned about as we look to the future is I talk to a lot of builders across the state, and they are not young, and they're not getting any younger. And I can see it becoming more of a problem. They're aging out of the system. And one of the things that Senator Olson and I hope this bill does is it ushers in that new group of builders that will build into the next, for the next generation. A couple points to be made here. And this could be almost any community in the state, but I'll mention just a few. Coffeyville's a town of 9,000. They have 0 builders. To get a housing project done last year, they had someone donate land. A local bank was the investor, and they brought in builders from Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is over an hour away. Iola in the last 5 years has had 4 housing starts, town of 7,000. They've torn down 20 homes in that time. Senator Hildebrand, you asked about the modular home. Iola is not terribly isolated compared to some other parts of the state. I've talked to Iola a good bit. I'm not sure how we get someone to build there. So modular may be the only opportunity. I'm not saying that'll be it, but maybe what we have to do in a community like Iola. I do encourage you to read 2 of the testimonies, one from Dennis Reardon and Solomon State Bank. Mr. Reardon obviously has a vested interest in Solomon. And Solomon, once again, isn't a terribly isolated place, but he has invested, or his bank has invested and lost about $25,000 to $30,000 per house just to get housing going in that community. And that's not sustainable. Another letter from George Eakin of Osborne Industries just that kind of outlines the difficulties they've had since the 90s of trying to get housing going. So with passage of this bill, housing could start tomorrow. We could start developing, we could start talking to engineers and getting ground platted, or more often than not, using already existing platted ground and get housing going. I believe Senator Longvine, I believe you're from Emporia. Mayor Gilligan and I have had conversations often that you desperately need an apartment project, a kind of a traditional apartment, not a 300 unit like we have in Johnson County, but maybe 64 units. We can't make the economics work. When Senator Olson and I developed or came up and worked on this legislation, we were thinking of places like Emporia and an apartment project. Senator Olson mentioned this before, but ultimately this creates, we hope, 600 housing units a year, which is $150 million in housing activity. I don't know how the economics work on withholdings tax and all those things, but to Senator Olson's point, that's about $5 million alone in sales tax on supplies. We do have a few examples there. I'm a little hesitant to give examples because where Senator Hildebrand's from is Southeast Kansas, a lot less expensive to build than Southwest Kansas, but there's some examples, and for instance, kind of the last example is what could occur for someone like a Habitat for Humanity. So appreciate your time, and if you have any questions, I'd certainly be glad to answer them.
Questions? Senator Fasco-Doe, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, you mentioned Dennis.
Reardon, yes.
His testimony. And so in here it says acquire and demolish homes that have outlived their youthfulness. So exactly how does that process look to you, so of acquiring those homes?
That's a great question, and I think 376 actually does a great job of maybe addressing that issue. But in Solomon, I'll just speak to, he gave me a tour, and they've taken homes that have become dilapidated. They purchased those, and then they keep filling in new homes with those, or new structures on those old lots.
So, but don't they have to go find that owner and how, when you said you could start building tomorrow, if you need to acquire the homes, that's going to take a little time for that sale of that home, or are we talking about homes that the city or county has deemed that they need to be demolished? I mean,
well, I wouldn't look at it just as existing lots. I would look at it as tomorrow, and it's not building tomorrow, because that's part of the problem too. If we start today, if we started today, the first time a person could move in today's environment into that home is probably August of 23. If we started today, and that would mean there were no big delays along the way. And right now there are tons of delays because of other kind of supply chain issues.
A lot of cities have land banks too, houses and land that's land vacant. So, I mean, them would probably be ready. And the one thing about if you're doing the onesies and twosies and small number, there's infrastructure in front of all them properties or they've had before. Further questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Ross. Okay, John Goodman. Goodyear, I'm sorry. Had to take a second look there.
It's all right, Mr. Chairman. I'd be a lot more famous.
Yeah. Wouldn't be here.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. John Goodyear, General Counsel with the League of Kansas Municipalities. And I'll keep my testimony short. We're supporting both of the bills that are being heard today for the same general reason. We hear every single year as we're developing our policy, our members are developing our policy, we hear about the housing problem. It's not just a small city issue. It's not just a big city issue. It truly is a statewide issue. And as such, our members have directed us through that policy to support any programs that we feel are going to encourage access to quality housing throughout the state. And we feel that Senate Bill 375 has the potential to do that, to set off a chain reaction. You know, tax credits are going to lead to more willing investors. Increased investment is going to lead to enhanced viability of projects, and the yield of those projects are going to be more housing in communities all across our state. So this Investor Tax Credit Act, as you said, it's going to be used more in rural communities. The population threshold is at 70,000 residents. Looking at our 625 cities, that's all but 6 of them. So this is going to be used all throughout the state. This isn't going to be limited to just your small cities. So with that, Mr. Chairman, like I said, I was brief. That's all I've got. I can stand for any questions at the appropriate time.
I think we'll hold questions and then run through the list and then ask questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Alex Oro.
Good morning, committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am Alex Earl, appearing on behalf of the Kansas Bankers Association. I will also be brief. As the previous conferee said, this is another tool that can be utilized in our state. But to back up on this real quick, the Kansas Bankers Association over the last year has been looking at housing very, very closely. You heard Mr. Vogel talk about a banker in Coffeyville. That banker is the chairman of my board currently. And he has stressed to us on the KBA staff about the lack of completed utilities to serve new home construction, lots plotted that need street completed to serve new home construction, doesn't have enough home builders, that people are commuting from outside the state into his community. They just don't have the homes. And this is an ongoing issue. We've known it for years. The study showed that. If you look at the statewide housing study, goals and strategies, the first one, the last sentence says, capital or incentives for these type of projects are often harder to find, and returns on these investments are seen as lower. To address this, a mix of incentives should both improve existing housing units and generate new construction. That's the #1 goal from the statewide study that was released. So from the KBA's perspective, we recognize there's a shortage of attainable housing for both low-income and moderate-income Kansans. A shortage of quality housing is an undeniable barrier to economic growth and development for any community, whether it be rural or urban. Bankers are committed to seeing that everyone with the dream of home ownership has that opportunity. And at the direction of our members, we support policies that will encourage the improvement of existing houses, generate new construction, and incentivize financial investment in the communities and for the customers we serve. We do believe Senate Bill 375 does achieve that. Like I said, it's another tool. Anything that we can do to help promote and develop in our state, we need to do. We do believe this also can be a very strong bipartisan issue. We all know this is an issue in both rural and urban, and hopefully we can come together on solutions to help fix this problem. And we appreciate the chairman. We appreciate this committee's work on these issues. And I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Derek Lee.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senators. My name is Derek Lee. I am an investor and a developer with a company named Building Kansas LLC. We have built a development in a small rural town thanks to the Rural Housing Incentive District and Moderate Income Housing Grant. We'll talk about that more when we get to 376, but I want to talk about 375 and give you an example, maybe paint the picture for what tax credits could do in a city like Salina, Kansas. Salina has done an extraordinary job with the help of the state bringing jobs in. We have Kubota Industries that recently took over an empty plant and it's going to have close to 1,000 people in it within 5 years. Great paying jobs. We have Tony's Pizza, already the world's largest production facility of frozen pizzas, going through a massive expansion, close to $1 billion. We have 1,500 jobs open, another 1,300 premium and high-paying jobs in the next 5 years. What we don't have is housing. We're a rural community. We simply do not have adequate housing. Most recent housing study says we are 1,300 units short, and that's estimated to grow by 1,000 in the next 7 years. For construction of residential housing to be able to take place, to complement the economic development that's already occurring, investor tax credits are required. To give you an example, a housing product that we build in another town is a townhome. It's 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2-car garage, over 1,500 square feet of space. It's a luxury finished home, 2-car garage. This home takes about $250,000 to construct with the efficiencies we found at the scale where we can build them, significantly less than anybody else could build them for. That still puts them out of reach for most families, especially in the moderate income housing range. With a $30,000 tax credit per unit, we can drop the price by passing that on 100% to the buyer to reach a $220,000 price point, almost $100,000 less than anything comparable in our market. More importantly, we can build 320 of these in the next 8 years. We can build 40 homes per year. We already have contractors that are ready. We have a development group that is ready for the infrastructure. What we don't have is all the pieces to the puzzle yet to move forward. We're very close, but we don't have everything yet. We know we can't go to market at $250, but these tax credits would help us get to $220. Again, we can pass that on 100% to the end buyer and put an $80 million project in Salina, Kansas. So we're an underserved rural community. We lack adequate housing. And if Senate Bill 375 passes, we can add all those homes to the community that so desperately needs them. And we'd be happy to replicate this in other communities across Kansas. Again, I thank you for your time. I can tell you that from Salina, one of the letters I'd encourage you to read is actually attached to 376 today, and that is from Eric Brown, that is the president of the Chamber of Commerce in Salina. And in there, he'll tell you that the #1 concern for employers, especially those investing hundreds of millions of dollars right now, is housing. And this is a great solution for bringing in a large amount of housing at a moderate income housing price point. And I'll be happy to answer questions when appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Allie Devine.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Allie Devine, and today I have the privilege of representing Kansas Farm Bureau, Kansas Corn Growers Association, Sunflower Electric Power Corporation, and the Northwest Kansas Economic Innovation Center. And the logo on it is not a registered logo, and you can't go look up for my badge on that particular piece because it doesn't exist. With me is also Claire Gustin in the back from Sunflower Electric and Josh Rowe from Corn Growers. Now, why are we here? We, about 2 years ago, started doing our own study of why we were not bringing in rural economic development projects to Kansas when we are a leader in agriculture across the state. We did our own study that verified everything that they've talked about today in the state housing assessment. Business development and housing are two of the things our own study said we needed to focus on. And we believe we started out with a lot of recommendations, but in this year, we're focusing on business development and housing. So, why did we stand up and support this? Largely because it's another tool. We think, as the prior speakers have said, a litany of tools put together good projects, and we think we could do that. In full disclosure, we are also asking for $50 million from the State General Fund. Why? And we want that money to be put in the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation. Got to get my acronym correct. Why? Because they have the ability to take those tools and put them together and meet the needs of a rural community. The reason we're saying $50 million for rural Kansas is because we know our projects can't always compete with the urban areas. Likewise, if you wanted for the urban areas to put money in there, we'll be right there with you. We'll support that. But the bottom line is we want to support all the tools, and we know that there is funding that's needed. So we wanted to bring that all to you today. And our testimony on the next bill is going to be on the same premises. So if you'd like, Mr. Chair, I'll answer questions, but thank you.
Thank you. Sean Miller? Nope. Okay. That's all I have as Mark Toom.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No problem. Thanks, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Mark Toom, I'm the Vice President of Governmental Affairs with the Kansas Association of Realtors. And just kind of reiterate a lot of what's already been said here. We're supportive of additional tools in this area. Our national association has advocated for a once-in-a-lifetime investment in housing. We also participated in the housing assessment study. We know that there's a huge problem, and it's a real problem for economic development. Increasing access to home ownership is a goal, obviously, of my association, but it should really be a goal of the state of Kansas. Simply put, we need more housing to support the needs of our current and future workforce. A shortage of quality housing is becoming an undeniable barrier to economic growth, and tools like this are going to be part of that solution. So again, we're advocating for increasing the number of tools, increasing the resources to help solve this problem. So with that, I'll sit down and answer any questions you may have at the appropriate time.
Okay. Questions, comments? Oh, wait, Martha, do you want, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Martha Smith, Kansas Manufactured Housing Association. I'm sorry I had a little snafu on Friday and didn't get to submit my testimony.
Yeah.
We also support the bill. We feel like any tool that you can provide that also incentivizes the private sector in housing is an excellent idea to actually invest in housing in the state of Kansas. So I can't add anything to what everybody else has already spoken to, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Okay. Are there any other proponents that want to speak? Not seeing any. Questions? Do we have questions? Senator Hildebrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Derek Lee.
Yes, sir.
Derek, in your testimony, you had mentioned something about 250,000 to 220.
Yes, sir.
Now, the 250 is the sale price, not the construction price. Was that what you were referring to?
Very close to the same, sir, yes.
So, someone like myself that's not really into, my personal opinion is taxes are too high in the state of Kansas, and property taxes are very high. And the first thing I look at is, why don't we just lower property taxes for everybody? But I'm guessing that the property taxes in Salina are not $30,000 a year. So lowering taxes probably would not incentivize you to build a bunch of buildings, houses.
Well, a couple things at play here. One, this project has already received designation as a rural housing incentive district. And the way we apply that is that there are no special assessment taxes on there. So the people that buy these homes, one of the benefits they're already receiving is that they pay the regular property tax, but not the extra. And in Salina, Kansas, it's often $30,000 to $60,000 that they like to do in special assessment taxes. A lot of people don't realize that till they buy a home and then realize the payment was out of their budget. So to answer your question on property tax, to keep the property taxes low, we utilize the Rural Housing Incentive District again, so that goes directly to the consumer. The $30,000 tax credit to lower the price on that home, again, that comes back to the developer. We pass that on to the end buyer. So that allows somebody to buy a home that otherwise could not. So again, in Eric Brown's testimony on 376, you'll see where we have companies interviewing people for well-paying positions. And they come in and they say, I would love to, but we've looked around town, you don't have housing. And when we talk to a realtor, they say, sorry, the day the home goes on the market, somebody pays 30 or 40 over list price. And it scares people away. We can't bring people into Salina when we can't provide a house for them. So a 1,500 plus square foot, 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom luxury finish home close to where both of these plants are expanding in a price range they can afford without special assessment taxes is all the difference in the world. And it creates a tax base. It's not just the $80 million we'll spend with contractors building the infrastructure and the homes, all of which are in Kansas. It is the tax base that it creates for the city of Salina, Saline County, and of course the state of Kansas.
Derek, thank you.
Absolutely.
Senator Cluse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate that clarification on the special assessment tax. I have a background in real estate. A lot of people don't take that into account.
Yeah.
I guess my question, though, is when these numbers were put together, you say home drops to a price not to exceed $220. With the inflation hike and the challenge we have on new construction these days, I mean, at least I see it in this area, how comfortable are you with that not to exceed 220? And I don't know if you could just give me a little dialogue
Absolutely.
On that area.
Very comfortable with that number today based on 2022, and that is on as recently as last week confirming with suppliers and subcontractors on what we can build for. I can tell you pre-pandemic, these numbers are up about $60,000 per side from what we could build for. So we could have built at a profit if we could build what we could 2 years ago. Of course, it started with lumber, and then everybody nationwide went up from there. And then, of course, contractors said, man, I haven't raised my rates in 10 years. I need just a little more. And all those little mores add up. Again, we have found efficiencies by building at scale. And everything goes out for a bid process, and we scrutinize. And we worked very, very hard to get to the 250 number and would love to get to the 220 number. And if a combination of programs came through and we could lower that even further, we'd be more than happy to do so. Again, our goal is to get as many homes built as possible.
Okay. Because you have in your statement here, we can build 40 new homes per year for the next 8 years. So looking out that far, you're comfortable there.
Absolutely. And we do already have, again, the materials and subcontractors ready to go if we can get something put together for more than the first 40 homes.
Thank you. Further questions? Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can appreciate wanting to add some housing to many of our rural areas and smaller cities. Now, where I'm from, Salina is a big city, and Salina and Hutchinson are where we go to shop sometimes. So in including the city of Topeka and the population of 60,000 or 70,000 doesn't really do a whole lot in my district. I have entire counties that have a population of under 3,000 people, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a housing problem. We also have a housing problem, and I would be interested in looking at something that not just provides a tax credit to the community or the builder, but providing some type of, a gateway to providing loans, low interest loans or interest-free loans to single families to either build in vacant lots or, some way in order to grow housing in parts of my district, because I don't have a single city or even county of a population of 60 or 70,000.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. Salina is just under 50,000. And when I was working with the Chamber of Commerce 20 years ago, their goal was to try to get to 50,000. They still haven't done it. They have the opportunity now if they're able to match the housing to the economic impact of the jobs they're providing. And then Salina is a regional city for a lot of those smaller towns. For example, Lindsborg, Kansas, that was our last development. That only happened because of Rural Housing Incentive District and Moderate Income Housing Grant, and it put homes in a 3,000 population town that has been asking for development for close to 20 years. And the impact there is tremendous. And I can talk about that when we get to 376, but I agree with you. It needs to be able to come into small towns, and programs like this are what make that happen. plain and simple, they don't pencil without it, and they're extremely well received with it, especially if, again, the transparency with the Department of Commerce is there, whoever's overseeing it with our books, so that everybody knows, including the taxpayer, where the money went. And it does bring people into Kansas.
Well, and when I was over the summer, me and Ross were talking, I mean, we had 12, 15 different things, but when you narrow it down, there's only certain things you can bring. I mean, I've got things doing what you're exactly saying. And I've thought through them, but, you know, it's hard to get people to buy in. I do believe there's probably a need in a few of the medium-sized cities in this state for the housing, like you're saying. You're also, at the minimum, if you use that 30,000, you're going to have 600. I mean, they're not all going to go to Salina. They're not all going to go to Emporia. There's going to be, you know, in the smallest town, you know, they can probably use, what, 5 or 10, and there's, you know, in reality, you're going to get to about 750, 800, 850, and you're doing that every year. Eventually, you're going to saturate the markets you need. You know, so that's my thought on it. I grew up in a town, it's probably, you know, I was born in a town that probably 1,500 or less now. And I remember growing up, there was a vacant square block vacant, and it was probably about 1976 where we used to fly our kites and hang out and play. In about 90 days, it became populated with houses, probably, I don't know, 12, 15 houses, and they basically put foundations in and brought modular housing in. And so I think there's needs in smaller towns for like maybe a modular house at that very, very small town, and I think that's what this targets. I think there's places like Arc City where I heard they're busing people back and forth to work there. I mean, several hundred people actually. You know, so I think this is one piece, and I think the next bill will go. And then there's low to moderate tax credits in Senate Bill 369. I keep saying Tuesday, it's 369. And I think that goes to meet another need. And I think Ally's working on some other funding. You're going to need them all. Yes. And if you know, these bills none of them touch my district, not a one, but I'm here trying to touch the rest of the state. And, you know, there's no way we can build these. My city's the 4th largest city in the state. You couldn't use any of probably the bills if we pass them in mind, but I believe it'll help the state. So, yep. Senator Fasco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that's so kind of you. It's not even in your district. Sir, would these homes be for purchase to own, or are you talking about rental properties, or both?
This particular development example is purchase to own. The goal of this is to get them at a price point where somebody in that moderate income housing range can afford one of these homes. We have also seen, again, from doing this, like in Lynchburg, Kansas, where we built this model, people that have lived in the town, active seniors, empty nesters, whatever you want to put to a group that are in a home that may not be ideal for them. It may have a lot of stairs they don't need. We build everything to the MIH spec in foundation as well as zero entry. And because of that, we see where now there's a new home option in a price range that they can afford, and it just opened up a really great price range of home as infill for people that have been trying to get into those neighborhoods, or like in Lynchburg, get into that town and haven't been able to for years. We had teachers and professors living outside of our town that are now able to move in.
Well, and really what this is, it's a tax credit that you can build and lower the price point, or it's a sellable one that makes the math work.
It makes the math work.
It doesn't matter when you go get a loan, and this is what I do understand on the banking side, it's all about math. And if you can't make that financial, it's not working, people. I mean, we've had two big spurts in this state's history in housing, 1900, 1930s. across this state, and then there was a spurt in the 70s. And besides them, there's really been no real big push for housing. And, we've went from 7 to 4 congressional districts. We're going to be down to 3 if we don't start doing something and investing in this state on housing. I've watched the town I was born in go from 2,000 to, it's probably 1,300 now, maybe less. And it's just going to keep dying.
Yes.
Them houses, they take one down, it disappears. Are there any further questions real quick? Because we need to get on to the second bill.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's close the hearing on 375, and we'll open the hearing on 376. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 376 makes amendments to an existing rural housing program. This is the Kansas Rural Housing Incentive District Act. Under the current law, this act authorizes cities with a population of less than 60,000 and counties with a population of less than 80,000 to issue special obligation bonds to help finance the infrastructure costs of residential housing or the cost of renovate some older existing residential buildings. Under the bill does two things with respect to this act. First of all, it expands the scope of the act so that the definition of city would also include the city of Topeka, regardless of its population. The bill also expands the list of permitted uses of those special obligation bond proceeds so that it could also be used to renovate or construct single-family and multifamily dwellings and other structures used for residential use on existing lots if the infrastructure has already been in place for 10 years. Finally, the bill would permit those proceeds to be used for these projects even when they're owned or leased by a private developer. There's that added provision to the act as well. The second thing the bill does is it increases the annual transfers from the State Economic Development Initiatives Fund to the State Housing Trust Fund. For fiscal years 2020 and 2021, that transfer amounted to $2 million. Under the bill for the next 2 fiscal years, the amount would increase to $20 million. The State Housing Trust Fund is administered by the Kansas Housing Resource Corporation, and under that law, it's used for the purpose of making loans and grants to rural cities and counties for housing development in the rural areas of the state. That increase in the funding does come with a directed allocation of that funding. 75% of that $20 million would continue to be used as under current law for the rural housing development, but the remaining 25% would be used by the Housing Resource Corporation for those loans and grants to cities and counties with a population of $60,000 or 60,000 people or more. And additionally, the bill would establish a limit of $900,000 for each recipient of a loan or grant under that section. So those are the two amendments with respect to the act. The bill will go into effect on July 1st of this year, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions? Senator Fasco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, so who exactly would one apply for that loan from?
I believe they applied to the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation for a loan or grant from the State Housing Trust Fund.
This is one of my bills, and basically what this does, this expands the RHID to Topeka. And then the second part is we've just had a budgetary item on the MIH funding of $2 million a year. Well, it's probably one of the most successful programs that we've ever had in the state. And what we did, we expanded that to a $20 million budgetary with 25% going to communities larger than 60. So then the 75% would still go to the smaller communities. And one of the things is, there's several of these guys that do these MIH grant projects, and they might have 10 projects ready to go. Well, with only 2 million, that pot's so small, that, you know, they're gonna pick their best two, and that's always in the bigger areas. So this is how you get the smaller projects. There's a couple other tweaks. I think we increased the grant size from 400,000 to 900,000. And I think the reason is because the cost has gone up in the last several years when that was originally done. So, is that correct, Jason?
Yes, it does increase to 900,000.
Yeah. You got questions for Jason? Okay. I'm going to skip over my testimony. I'm going to go right to Ross Vogel, and then I'll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the Rural Housing Incentive District and Moderate Income Housing Grant, I've worked in other states, and they are the best housing programs that you will find anywhere. They just have one problem: they're not big enough. By the way, I'm not a big government guy. It's just after driven across the state for 8 years, thinking about and looking at these issues, there's more participation. As I always say, I'm the bearer of bad news here when I start a project. Is that the solutions aren't fun and they aren't easy, and that's reality. One thing that we did do in the Rural Housing Incentive District that I think is really, really important that we haven't discussed, so I'll try to be real quick. And you guys mentioned it, existing lots, right now, hard cost on a lot in the lease on a new lot is $40,000. That doesn't include land, that doesn't include soft cost. So every time when you drive by a community in an existing lot, that's a $40,000 asset sitting there. And we have to start to activate those assets. So we did do an expansion on the Rural Housing Incentive District that would allow weed stuff, but it would just be really, really valuable to do so. We did the same thing for second story on Senate Bill 90 last year, second story downtown. It would in essence do the same thing for existing lots. So Senator Straub's district, where you have a lot of rural communities, it would just be huge because the numbers don't work, and that's a way to make the numbers work. And layering these programs together, I don't think you need to use all three we're talking about today in every instance, but layering those together where you can be real nimble and flexible. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, is figure out a way for builders, developers, and community groups and employers to be nimble and flexible. And finally, on the Moderate Income Housing Grant, we have folks from Kansas Housing Resources today, Ryan Vincent and Alyssa Ice. They do a great job with that program. There is just one huge problem with that program. It is way, way, way underfunded. I'm one of those people that Senator Olson mentioned, that I do 1 or 2 projects a year. The reality is I could probably do 10. It's just not worth my time or the effort for them to look at my application when we're going to bust through the $2 million with the first 7 applications that come through the door. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ross. We'll hold questions at the end. Derek Lee.
Thank you, Chairman and Senators. In support of Senate Bill 376, I touched on this a little bit, but to give you some overview on a development called Stockholm Estates in Lynchburg, Kansas. Lynchburg, Kansas, for close to 20 years, had been without new housing development. This despite professors, teachers, others in the town that worked there and wanted to live there, but there simply was not housing. And again, heard from a lot of folks that are in homes that are not adequate for them currently, but they really didn't have any options. We use the MIH grant money and the RHID process, again, off the price of the home lot. We're able to provide moderate income housing to new families that are now in the Lynchburg community. We built our model, our first phase of 50 lots, on selling at best 10 lots a year for the first 5 years. Those in the housing industry said, "You're crazy, you can't bring that much interest to Lynchburg, Kansas." We said, no, the interest is already there, and it is in these small towns. This town of 3,000 people, people want to live here, there's just no housing. Last year was the first full year we had those lots for sale, and we sold 25 of the 50. We sold half of the phase 1 development the first year that they were available. So we are getting people to Lynchburg, Kansas. We had a professor come in, and the new housing was one of the draws that got him to the college in Lynchburg, Kansas. That's big, right? The school district, of course, was a proponent. In fact, it was the city that approached us, not the other way around, about doing a development. The city was already on board, the county was already on board, the school system was already on board. And Senator Straub, you mentioned these small communities, and Chairman, you mentioned your community where that population drops. There's a real fear for these school districts as they lose children, right? Not far from Lynchburg is a town, Marquette, that did lose their school system. And that's a real concern. Whether it's dropping in classification, which isn't probably as important as simply losing your school district, this is a big deal to rural Kansas. These are great communities, and programs like this help keep these towns viable. So we have brought more population to rural Kansas town. Again, it has opened that backfill of homes, people that lived in homes that they should have moved out of 10 years ago because of the stairs or whatever else, that are now able to buy a single level home or whatever meets their needs. Of course, those buying the home because of the RHID and MIH grant have benefited, and we do have a clawback in place so that somebody can't buy the home and resell it and take advantage of the programs being offered. They have to be committed to living there for at least 5 years. But we have put more kids in the schools. We're growing the tax base. The local businesses are beyond happy because they see population growth, and that has not happened for some time in our small town. So again, we will continue to invest in rural communities as long as there are programs and funding for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. We'll hold questions. Alex Oral.
Yes, good morning, committee. Again, for the record, my name is Alex Oral, appearing on behalf of the Kansas Bankers Association in support of Senate Bill 376. I'm not going to reiterate my comments from the earlier bill. They are the same, but a few things on this bill. I want to refer back to the housing study that was released. You know, approximately 30% of the housing stock in Kansas was built before 1960. Consequently, the condition of housing in many areas, especially rural areas, is below average. So this bill does do something to try and fix that and go after the goals of that statewide study. So, Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate that. I also do share the comments or belief of Mr. Vogel and the KHRC. They do a fantastic job. Regarding other rural initiatives, Representative Waymaster is also working on a rural home loan guarantee piece of legislation on the House side that Senator Straub, you mentioned that could help your community. And regarding some rural banker input, some of these things regarding in the rural areas specifically are just vacant houses. They actually have the stock. They're just vacant. And some renovation of those properties could actually work instead of possibly new construction. So having that ability and incentivizing that could help. So once again, another tool that we do support. Appreciate this committee's work. Thank you.
Thank you. John Goodyear.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I will be quick again. John Goodyear, General Counsel, League of Kansas Municipalities. We support 376 for the same reasons we support 375. Just wanted to point out a couple things with this bill. 376 will expand that RHID Act to allow cities and counties to use bond proceeds to fund renovation or construction of residential structures on existing lots with existing infrastructure. That's tremendous. That's something that we haven't been able to do so before, and this is a good expansion of that RHID Act. The second piece is that direct transfer of $20 million to the State Housing Trust Fund. And I have to tell you, that is a significant investment by the state, and it could serve to be a real catalyst for growth in our cities and has the potential to make real progress in addressing what we know is a statewide issue. With that, Mr. Chairman, that's all I've got. I'll answer questions if you need me to at the appropriate time.
Sure. Thanks,
Thank you.
Sean Miller. Okay. Maybe we get that in the wrong place. Allie Devine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agree, this is another tool for rural economic development, rural housing development. I'm going to reiterate my prior request that you all pay attention to the appropriation process. I think we all know that the spark money's in play. We all know that there was the State Finance Council had to put aside $100 million for business development. A lot of that has to be tied to housing at some point. The BASE program, which is where that $100 million is now sitting, may or may not allow for projects in rural Kansas. And we're trying to get clarity of exactly what can we do with housing in addition to that business development piece. It's kind of my interpretation based on listening to their webinar last week that you can use some of that money for housing if it's tied to a business development project. So outside of that, we still have $730 million in Spark, 730, 750, depending on what who you talk to. Bottom line is the advisory committees have been set up. They're talking about input for what should we spend that money on. We plan to go back to them and say, hey, put it in the trust fund, the account you're talking about. The governor put $20 million into MIH. We think that ought to be a lot bigger, but we also think the money ought to be available to all of the programs within the trust fund, so in the corporation. So I'm just saying, we're going to work the appropriations process, but it all ties together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ally. Mark Toom.
I'll also be very brief. Mark Toom, Vice President of Governmental Affairs with the Kansas Association of Realtors. I'm going to focus just on the Rural Housing Incentive District. This is something that we've been very supportive of, and I think it's a game changer to make the changes that you're doing, and I think for particular to be able to use existing infrastructure, and I think it's just such more efficient to be able to use existing footprint of a lot in terms of utilities. It just makes it more efficient from a local government point of view. Also makes more efficient from a development point of view. Also, the investment long overdue. I think that we're going to see that there's a large number of projects that probably don't even try to apply when you're only dealing with $2 million. Having, as it is in here, an additional investment of $20 million, I think the case will be made that the investment could be even more than that. So with that, I'll stand for questions. Thanks.
Questions? Okay, let's hold them till the end. Martha, do you want to speak, or?
Again, thank you. Martha Smith, Kansas Manufactured Housing Association. Again, we support this legislation. It does provide another tool. I should say that we feel like manufactured housing could be part of the housing solution, especially for rural communities that don't have a tradesman or a contractor or a lumber yard or a concrete company. We do housing across the country, across the state. You name it, we build it and we take it there. We do multifamily, we do two-story. If you have a chance, you might go to our website, kansashousing.org. We have pictures of homes that my members have done that are in Kansas. I think you might be surprised. We still do the single section, but we also do very nice multi-sectional homes that you would never know were built in a factory. So I'd be happy to stand for any questions at the appropriate time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any further proponents that want to speak? Not seeing any questions. Do we have any questions? My comment is, this is another one. MIH, we already have it. It's worked really well. We were trying to just put more money in the pot, tune it up, so it gets out and it gets to the smaller towns. I think with bigger grants, I think that helps, but I think more money, I think that helps too. Expanding the RHID to Shawnee, I believe there's places all across the state that need housing. And, we got to do something about it. If we don't, our state's going to keep dying. The town I grew up in, the first part of my life, it was on I-70. I mean, think about that. You got a lot of traffic coming by, and that town's still dying. So this is my shot to try to do something. So we'll go ahead and move on. We got one neutral, Ryan Vinson. And there's some written on both bills you might want to read too. Go ahead, Ryan.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. In my 17 years at Kansas Housing, I've never had a week of excitement and activity at the State House like I am seeing right now. I've been the lonely voice in the wilderness, crying out about the need for safe, affordable, accessible housing in our state. And yet we've got so many great partners, but it is truly coalescing right now. The stars are aligning. The moment is now. And we're officially neutral because we are a public corporation and do not take a partisan or any kind of political stance on one bill over another. However, we certainly support any investment in housing in our state. You've heard about this, the state housing study. I won't take your time with that. It's certainly been a big catalyst for these discussions. Since we administer the moderate income housing program, I just want to give a couple quick facts that I think will be useful in your deliberations on it. We currently receive 3 applications for every 1 application that we can fund. Since 2012, we have received 185 applications. Remind you, this is for $2 million a year. Requesting $57 million, and we've had $20 million to award. We've used that $20 million well. It's been used for infrastructure, for actual housing development, for a variety of different housing uses. We leverage $6 for every $1 in state money that we spend. We have a universe of applications that are ready to fund. In 2021, we funded 9 out of 28 applications we received. In 2020, we funded 7 out of 24. That equates to 24 applications requesting $9 million that are ready to proceed to development if we had the resources today. So with $20 million, we estimate that we could build 590 units of housing imminently. Obviously, expanding it to urban areas would allow us to serve more stakeholders. But those are the highlights I wanted to make sure the committee was aware of. We're pleased to be a partner and to take whatever tools you give us to ensure that we help unlock homes in Kansas. Thank you.
Senator Reichman?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. That's the strongest neutral I've ever heard. We're talking about 20 million here, and all the ones you're talking are not being accepted, and so on and so forth. And I'm not suggesting this, but how much money, if you thought could go in there, that we could use?
Senator, that is the $1 million question. Not to use another number for you, but we are having a lot of thrown at us right now, and we have to be very careful how much capacity we have, and not just capacity at Kansas Housing, but our developer and our contractor network in the state. I'll tell you the key is sustainability. If people know that we're getting a one-time shot of money and it's gone, then there will be interest, and I think we'll get a lot more applications than we normally do. But then developers who are doing business in Denver and Oklahoma City and Omaha may not be as interested. But if we have sustainable funding like this bill and some others suggest, if we have the ability to commit that in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, we're going to have real money, we're going to actually be able to attract those developers and contractors. We're going to be able to encourage people who are thinking about going into the skilled trades to do so. So we do have capacity now to be able to get a lot of these dollars out the door. We have a universe of applications that are waiting to be funded, but taking it to the next step is going to take sustainability.
Thank you. I think.
Well, and I think that's a good point because, you know, in a lot of rural areas, there's nobody building out there. And if they see that, you know, there's going to be funding over a longer period of time committed, it'll be more Kansas jobs that, you know, people will go into that trade, start the building, just like you said. And, you know, I think that's key. You know, what happens when the money is gone from Spark? This is something we need to commit. I mean, a small portion of our budget, this is, you know, if a business you spend 5, 10, 15% on your research and development. I mean, we've got to invest something into housing or there's going to be no place for anybody to live. And we need to commit over time. I mean, eventually what'll happen probably is that 5 years out or 7 years out, eventually we won't use it all. And then we'll probably eventually taper it back. But for the short term, we need to go gangbusters, try to catch up. Any further questions? Wow, exciting day. We got Senate Bill 369. It's a tax credit bill that will be up on Wednesday. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you.